On November 7th, from a field of 7, 3 people will be selected to represent Cupertino citizens on the City Council. While this election will have nowhere near the magnitude of a national election, it will have a direct impact on anybody living in the city. I'm Donna Cray, Public Information Officer for the City of Cupertino. I'll be speaking with Dorothy Cornelius, Cupertino City Clerk, about the political process in Cupertino and about this year's election. That's all next on Take 53.
Just a fraction of what we spend dining out could help pick up the tab for a good cause. A small part of what we spend on sports could help keep our community in shape, or some of our time on the phone could help answer society's problems. Won't you get involved? By giving 5% of your income and volunteering 5 hours per week, you can really help your community. This year, make it your goal to give 5. What you get back is immeasurable.
There was a time when an 18-year-old couldn't vote. A time when there was no meaningful way for young adults to express their opinions. What changed that? The 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution, the words we live by.
My guest today is Dorothy Cornelius, Cupertino City Clerk. Dorothy's been with the city for 12 years, 10 as a city clerk. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thanks, Donna. It's good to be here, especially about one of my favorite topics.
Good. Well, we're talking about the election, and I'm wondering if you can give us some information about who the candidates are this year.
Yes, the filing period is over. It ended August 16th, since we did not have one of our incumbents running, and we do have 7 eligible candidates. 2 of them I'm sure the voters are familiar with. They're the 2 incumbents, John Plungy and John Gatto. The other people who are running are Laura Lee Sorensen, who's currently on the Planning Commission, Nick Szabo, who's also on the Planning Commission. There's Wayland Lim, Thomas Hines, and Marshall Goldman. And we expect to be learning more about them as the campaign process goes along. Those are the only 7 who took out papers, actually, and all of them did file.
It's now too late for anybody else who wishes to run for city council, is that correct?
That's correct in this election.
Okay.
Yes.
Were there any fees involved? Did any of these people have to pay any money in order to become candidates?
No, our city has always made it a policy that the city itself will pay for the printing of the campaign statements that go out to each registered voter. That consists of 200 words. It lists the candidates' qualifications and a little bit about their background. Like I say, this goes to every registered voter. The city does pick up the fee. However, if they have a voluntary Spanish translation, then they are asked to pick up that additional fee. But as far as filing, what they do is they get nomination papers, and they are required to get the signature of at least 20 registered voters in the city and submit that, and we do not have a filing fee.
Are there any restrictions on who can file?
Yes, there are some basic restrictions for candidates. One, they must be 18 years of age. They must be qualified electors of the city. They cannot be in prison. They cannot be on probation for a felony. They must, of course, be citizens to do those kinds of things. And I believe they must live in the area in which they're running for something like 29 days prior to.
Mm-hmm. Now, Cupertino doesn't directly elect a mayor. Can you give us some information on how our mayor is selected?
Yes, every city who doesn't have a directly elected mayor has its own process. We do have 5 council members, and each year in November they elect from amongst themselves one of their members to serve as the mayor for 1 year. This is usually done in, we call it a sort of rotating process. Council members are elected in staggering terms. 3 are elected at one time, and then 2 years later, 2 others are elected. So say this year will be 3 will be elected, and they'll be considered new council members, even though they may have served previous terms. The 2 remaining council members, one of them will become the next mayor, and that will be whichever one was the highest vote getter in the last election. And then the other one will become vice mayor. Now, this is not a written policy, it's not a law, it's just a tradition that we have followed in this city. And we have never had any reason not to continue that tradition.
We'll take a break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about voting procedures and some other election-related material.
Imagine a world without trees, a barren, gritty, dusty world where giant dust storms roll across the countryside. Now, imagine a world with trees, conservation trees, where tree roots grip and hold the topsoil. A world without trees is no world for me or for you. Conservation trees make the difference. This is Eddie Albert. Write the National Arbor Day Foundation for your free Conservation Trees brochure.
In Chile, 8 million people who want to vote can't. In South Africa, 25 million people who want to vote can't. In the United States, 81 million people who can vote don't. Democracy. It can't be of the people and for the people if it's not by the people. Vote.
We're back now with Dorothy Cornelius, Cupertino City Clerk, talking about this year's election in November. Dorothy, are there particular groups in Cupertino that will actively endorse a candidate, such as the Chamber of Commerce?
Well, there aren't very many, but yes, the Chamber in the past has actively endorsed candidates. Our local newspaper, the Courier, has also endorsed candidates, and the San Jose Mercury News has endorsed Cupertino Council candidates before.
It is commonly believed that incumbents do have an advantage over some of the other people running for the first time. Do we have any idea what the percentage is of how many times the incumbent will win in an election in Cupertino?
Well, I have checked our records going back to 1955 when our first council election took place. And since that time, all but 6 of the incumbents who ran for re-election have been re-elected. And one of those 6 lost the first election, his second try, but then tried again 2 years later and won that election. But all the rest of the incumbents who have chosen to run again have been re-elected.
With the exception of 6.
Of those 6, that's correct.
What advantages does a non-incumbent have?
Well, the first thing I thought of as far as what's an advantage for a non-incumbent is that they haven't made a decision that displeased a large group of people. That's a pretty obvious one. And it is an advantage in some elections. They haven't had the opportunity to make a decision because I don't know what council member at some time in their term is not going to make a decision that some people will not be happy with.
What does the city do to help non-incumbents understand fully the government process, maybe people who aren't really too familiar with how the government works?
Well, our city actually has a rather involved process, and I feel that we really do a very good job. To start with, anyone who comes in to take out nomination papers for a council seat is given what I call the candidate's handbook, which is a rather bulky book, which explains the history of the city. It explains what each department does. It gives a small introduction to the budget. It explains all of the state laws as far as running for election and the various kinds of forms that are required. It gives a condensed election calendar that tells what will occur during the election process. And once they file and qualify as candidates, they receive the full agenda packet for every single city council meeting, just like any council member does. In addition, they receive copies of the Fair Political Practices Commission bulletins, so they're kept abreast of the latest in state laws pertaining to election disclosure. They receive the weekly notes from the city manager that go to the city council. They receive copies of all of the sound-off replies that we get that are taken from the Cupertino Scene booklet. And they receive the bulletin I send out the day after a council meeting that lists council actions and what staff members are responsible for handling those actions. And they receive basically all public information that council members receive. In addition to that, we go one step further. In fact, we do have a candidates orientation scheduled where candidates will meet with the city manager and all department heads to discuss what's going on in the city.
Okay, can you tell me how many people, how many residents in Cupertino voted in the last local election?
Oh, I can give you the % of registered voters in Cupertino. In our last council election, we had a 20.9% turnout for council election. And this is less than I know surrounding cities have. And it's really upsetting to me, not just because we put a lot of work into elections, but because at the local level, your vote has the most power because fewer people are voting. So obviously one vote holds a tremendous amount of power. And I wonder sometimes if the people realize that the decisions made by their local officials have the most direct and the quickest impact on their lives of any political decisions made.
Why do you think Cupertino's statistics are so low?
Well, there's all over right now, there's a lot of questioning as to why people aren't voting. And in the past, there's been two thoughts on that. One is it shows satisfaction of the people, and I'm sure there's some validity to that. Another is there's apathy because people feel their vote doesn't really count. And there's probably some real validity to that one too. But basically in our city, I feel there has been a lot of satisfaction with elected officials. People are basically satisfied with their lives. However, one thing that I find also disturbing about that is the lack of voter registration among young adults. 18-year-olds are not registering to vote. And one of the things that I think that we're going to be doing in our city is trying to work with the school districts and encourage 18-year-olds to register and to vote.
I think we all realize how important it is to our democratic process to have people vote. But why do you personally think it's important?
Well, I just came back from a seminar in Sacramento, and I've always thought that voting was probably the ultimate voter participation, and the feeling from some of the speakers there was that's the lowest level of participation in a democracy. And the more I think about it, the more I can see that viewpoint. Because if you don't participate as a voter, you're certainly not going to be participating as a volunteer in support or opposition to a candidate or measure. You're not going to be soliciting campaign contributions for someone that you believe in or something that you believe in. There's just all kinds of things that happen. And so I'm beginning to think it's true that voting is probably the lowest level of participation. And if we aren't even going to get out and vote for our local officials, then we're leaving it up to somebody else. We're really not taking part in our government. And I can't imagine why anybody would want to leave. Give someone else the responsibility of picking out their leaders. Mm-hmm. There's concern that leads to a decline in democracy. The whole democratic process is in jeopardy if people don't get out and vote.
Mm-hmm. How can the city encourage its residents to cast their ballots?
The city this year is actively pursuing both registration and voter outreach. And in fact, Donna, you were very instrumental in one of the programs that I thought we did a great job on, and that was the swing program. And it did involve getting young children involved in local government. It has been found that voting is a habit, and it needs children from a very young age need to start getting involved in government at the most simple level. Even your school elections can be very effective. I know there are schools now that in other states, just as part of the process, they require a pre-registration to vote in a school election. Our city is doing programs like this. I understand that you will be, or someone from the city will be interviewing council candidates for Channel 53. Those will be shown, and there's a possibility they'll be available in the library for citizens to check out and watch at home at their convenience. I also plan to be working through the school districts and with the League of Women Voters in voter registration outreach. And I have taken our handy-dandy mail-in voter registration forms to both our senior center and to McClellan Ranch Park, to the recreation offices there. So they're now available in 3 city buildings. I know that through the Cupertino Scene there will be articles published, and I'm sure the Courier and the San Jose Mercury News will try to give us really good coverage in our election process.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned League of Women Voters. That brings to mind some of the programs that they may have to get people to register. I remember seeing a booth of theirs at the Country Festival just last month, and I understand that they registered 89 people on that one weekend.
That's great.
Do they do other things besides set up booths and things like that? What kinds of programs are they involved in?
Yes, they do. And one of the things they do that's probably one of the most beneficial things they do for the voters is their candidates forum. Prior to each election, they do conduct a candidates forum where the public has the opportunity to hear each candidate and listen to their viewpoints. And our Chamber of Commerce does the same thing. They also have a candidates forum and gives each council candidate an opportunity to address the group and to answer questions. But the League has a long history of service in voter outreach. And I understand they also will go into the schools and register students. In fact, our education code has the last 2 weeks in April as voter registration days in the schools. And some of the League of Women Voters chapters do go into the school those 2 weeks and register 18-year-olds to vote.
Great. Do you happen to know what other cities are doing along these same lines, and are there specific programs that the city might be contemplating picking up?
Well, other cities are doing very much the same kinds of things that we're starting to do. And I belong to a group, the City Clerks Association of California, and the City Clerks group this Friday is meeting, and one of the things we're going to be discussing is participating along with the State Department of Education, the Secretary of State's office, and the League of Women Voters in a voting power program called Don't Give Up the Power, because voting is power. And that's something I want our city to get involved in. I have contacted the Secretary of State's office, and they're going to be sending me the information on participating in that program too.
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about the videotape that is now running on Channel 53? I forget the name of it. Well,
I know what you're talking about.
Which one I mean.
It's the one that was prepared by the Registrar's office down in San Diego County.
First Tuesday.
First Tuesday. The science fiction type story, and we hope it always remains a science fiction story. And this is a really good tape, I feel. And it shows what can happen when you neglect voting, because there's a possibility of losing that right, and it's something we don't want to lose. But the tape deals with that is strictly because people don't show up at the polls anymore. Somebody in power decides that elections are no longer necessary, and they are outlawed. And then something, I believe it's about 40 years later, a group of young people who are radicals try to reinstitute the election process. And the specific purpose of that tape is to kind of make people stop and think that maybe they shouldn't take voting for granted, that it's always going to be available, because it's not always available in all countries. And so we really want to protect that right, use that right, get out and vote.
We'll take a short break now. When we come back, we'll talk about how to register.
Come from?
And that this free society speaks with power, force, and decision. In this crusade,
The political machine that put these people into office is still run by the same person. You. Democracy. It can't be of the people and for the people if it's not by the people. Vote.
We're back with Dorothy Cornelius, Cupertino City Clerk. Dorothy, how do people register?
Oh, California has actually made it about as easy as any state has it in the union right now. There's a very simple mail-in card, and these cards are available obviously at the Registrar of Voters office in San Jose, also at City Hall, our Senior Center, and McClellan Ranch Park. It is postage paid. It's already addressed to the Registrar's office. All you do is complete the form at the top: name, address, occupation, date of birth, political party, birthplace. Telephone number is optional, and if you have previously registered in another county or at another address, then they ask that you check that, and then so they can cancel a previous registration. You sign it and you drop it in your nearest mailbox. It really is that simple. The thing to remember is that if you have moved since the last time you voted, you must re-register to be able to vote in November. And the registration deadline is October 10th. Speaking of barriers to voting, one of the things that comes up all the time is pre-registrations. There is a feeling that perhaps having to register in advance of the election discourages some people from voting, because by the time they think about registering, the deadline has been passed. I know there is at federal level, and I believe at state level too possibly, there is legislation being considered that would allow for same-day registration. So if, say, the day of the election comes along, you decide, gee, I'd really like to vote, you can run down to the polls and register and vote at the same time. The concern about that has been fraud possibility, but it does seem in this day and age of computers and instant information that eventually that will be worked out, and that could be a possibility. Another thing being looked at is what we call motor voter bills, and that is when people go in to get their driver's license at the Department of Motor Vehicles, they can check a little box and it says, do you want this to be your voter registration? And if they've checked yes, they do, therefore they are registered to vote at that time. But in the meantime, this mail registration is about as handy as you can get. And if anybody's interested in voting, registering, has any questions, they certainly could call City Hall or come by City Hall and come to my office, and I'll be happy to help them complete the form or just answer their questions. And also, I'm sure the Registrar of Voters office would be delighted to hear from them, too.
Okay, and that deadline again was October 10th?
October 10th
okay.
to register to vote for the November 7th election.
Okay, now what about people who are already registered but who would like to volunteer to help registering other people?
All right. The League of Women Voters, I'm sure, would be just delighted to hear from them because, as you know, they are very actively involved in registering people. if you register other people and they do not mail the card direct, there is a little tag at the end of this form that is completed by the person who receives this affidavit of registration. The person who has been recruiting for registration signs and leaves that with the person who filled out the form. That way, in case there's ever any question, there is a way to track who actually mailed the form. Mm-hmm. But I would suggest anyone interested in calling the local League of Women Voters. They're always happy to get volunteers.
Okay, good. Dorothy, we talked earlier about some of the reasons why people didn't want to vote or didn't actually go to the polls. And I have heard people say that they don't really believe that their vote makes a difference. Do you have a response to that?
Well, I do, and it's a very personal response. Prior to coming to work for the city of Cupertino, and I worked for the city of Fremont, and I'll remember my first election there were several candidates, I'm sure a minimum of 6, and 3 positions open. And the person who came in 4th in the election was only behind by 3 votes. Now, it may well be there were 4 other people out there who would have liked to have seen him elected, but just didn't feel that it mattered whether or not they vote. Well, it mattered, because if the 4 of them had gone out and voted for that person, he would have been a council member in that election. So yes, definitely, every vote counts. And if you don't vote because you feel things are going along fine and your vote's not needed, well, I think it's important to go out and vote anyway and simply show support for the kinds of decisions that have been made, and just to support your local council member. And if you feel that a change needs to be made, but one vote isn't enough to make that change, well, there may be a lot of other people who feel the same way, and every vote will make a difference.
Great, okay. Before we end, I'd like to have the number of the registrar's office for our viewers.
I forgot, I'm sorry. That number is, of course, 408, because it is located in San Jose, and the number is 298-7400.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Dorothy, for being with us today.
Thank you.
I'm Donna Cray, and I'll see you next time on Take 53.